Hello, and welcome to episode 260 of The Modern Manager. I'm your host, Mamie Canfor Stewart. Today's guest is Dr. Stephen Barden. Stephen is an accomplished coach, mentor, and author specializing in developing top leaders and organizational cultures. He has a decade of experience in the media, technology, and communication sectors, including 10 years as a CEO. Stephen brings a unique perspective on leadership in business. And he shares a lot of that as the author of the rigorously researched book, How Successful Leaders Do Business with Their World. Stephen and I talk about his navigational stance concept that depicts how leaders see themselves in relation to the world around them. We get into the navigational compass, which he shares some of the behaviors and mindsets that great managers possess. Now here's the conversation. Thank you so much for joining me today, Stephen. This is going to be really fun because I spent last night reading your book, and I feel like it was so obvious, but also so not what I've really thought about when I think about leadership before. So I feel like my brain was starting to tingle and explode. And I'm excited to get to talk with you and hear more about these interesting ways of understanding what makes for good leadership. So thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So let's just start at the beginning with this concept of the navigational stance, because this is I think the fundamental principle that all of the other thinking builds off of. So can you explain to us, what is this navigational stance and how do we develop this mindset in each of ourselves?
Bit of a backstory on that. I did some research for a doctorate I was doing after I'd been a CEO and a senior manager for a couple of decades. Then I'd been a coach. And I wanted to know from a group of people that I interviewed, and they were top military leaders, top business, commercial leaders, and top academics. And they were really objectively very successful. And I interviewed them, and what I wanted to know actually initially was, how did they learn? What did they learn? What was their experience of learning as they were getting into that top position? How did they learn when they were under fire? But the interview, I don't know if you get that, Mamie, but sometimes when you're talking to somebody and you're asking them questions, the answers seem to be quite formulaic. They're quite thin in many ways. They give you lots of technical details, but there was no heart in it. And then they started talking about their childhood. For some reason, they kept on saying, well, when I was a kid, my mother used to say that I could cure cancer at 4. And somebody else said, when I was a child, I was quite weak and I was bullied at school, so I developed tactics to overcome this, etc., etc. And so I started to dig in because it was almost as if a light bulb went down. The richness started coming through, and I started digging into this. And what I discovered through these interviews, and there was a huge amount of data that I went through, was that these people had developed what I call the navigational stance, and I'll talk about it in a little while. They developed a basic assumption about their relationship with the world, with their world being starting off with their families and then moving on to their schools, etc., etc. And that relationship was one which I filtered as power. They either saw the world as having much more power than they have, or even more power than they had, or less power than they had. So these particular ones, because they were successful, most of them had what I call a partnering stance to the world. This was their basic assumption that the world was, and they had a manageable power balance. They could do business with the world. And that's why I called it the book, How Successful Leaders Do Business with the World. And they could do business. They could work with it. Bad things happened. It wasn't because the world was putting things in their way. It was because they hadn't done their job properly. So the navigational stance comes out of the child's exploration to try and find its identity, to try and find space for itself, to try and find ways, as I say in the book, I think, to try and find ways to learn and to learn better, to do only one thing: to act and to manage better the world that they're in.
It's so fascinating how it's these really early experiences that so powerfully shape the way that we think about the world, the way that we interact with the world. And this partnering stance that the world is it's something that I can navigate, it's something that I can manage and work with, feels, I think, very obvious maybe for those of us who feel that way. But what are some of the other stances, or what are the other ways that we maybe have learned the world exists for us or against us?
If you look at it on a spectrum, you would get people who actually come out of the world saying the world is just too much for me. My assumption is that the world is so powerful that I'm either, and that's at that sort of abused, if you like, extreme. I'm either going to hide from it, or I actually have to destroy it because it'll destroy me. That's one extreme. The other extreme, which I suspect only happens in extremely privileged, isolated families, is I'm so powerful. I'm so much more powerful than the world that I don't have to even think about it. I'll just harness it to my needs. And of course, along that spectrum, you'll get less extreme, if you like. So you'll get where the world, you are competing against the world. You always have to prove yourself against the world. And in fact, one of the key things you'll find with people who have this oppositional stance, where the world is opposing them, is they will talk about competing. They will talk about proving themselves. I have to prove myself. I've got 100 days to make my mark on this team, on this company. I have to prove myself. And that's basically saying I have to prove myself against the world, rather than, hey, I'm here. I now going to see what's going to happen. And now I want to see what the reality is. And I will work with it. I will see what's happening, and I will work with it, and I will manage it, and I will take it to its destination.
I can see how all of these different stances could be formed. And it sounds like that with each of these different stances, it then dictates how we interpret what's happening around us and our behaviors for how we move forward and what we do and how we respond to situations. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, you will get them in different ways. I've had a client a number of years ago whose entire identity, if you like, was based on the fact that he could have this specialist knowledge of project management. He was a very good project manager. The problem was that because he was clinging to this identity as a project manager, because that was the way he could make himself heard in the adult world, when he moved to another company, he completely failed, because he didn't look around and realize that the way the new company was doing project management, the way the new company related within the team, was completely different to the previous company. So he had been, if you like, so clinging to that identity because he needed to make a difference in the world in that way, that he couldn't see the difference. He couldn't change course. He couldn't navigate, in other words.
Fascinating. That this can actually start to inhibit us. It can be in one context really a force that drives us forward, and then in a different context, suddenly the thing that is holding us back.
Yeah. It's interesting. You know, one of the things that I always say about these really successful leaders, and I continue doing the research, obviously, with others and finding people who are objectively successful, is that they don't compete. My favorite cynical phrase is, they may roll right over you if you get in the way, but they won't compete against you. I knew two well-known publishers and media moguls, I suppose you'd call them, many years ago. And the one would be always looking to see what the other one was doing. They were two different companies. They were both successful. And the one would look at what the other one was doing. What is so and so doing? How's he doing? What is he going to make a bid on this company? Do you think? What do you think I should do? And the other one had absolutely no interest in competing. The one who had no interest in competing went on to make a huge empire. The other one collapsed. I'm not saying it was directly related, but it was very interesting because the one saw himself as having to fight and compete against the world, including, of course, the fellow publisher.
So let's talk about some of these behaviors that people who have this partnering stance, like this media mogul you just mentioned, who is so successful, like what are some of the mindsets, you call them compass points, that this set of folks embrace that contribute to them being so successful?
So a few things. One is they're immensely holistic, and you can see why, by the way. So holistic, I mean, they will look at their organization like an ecosystem. So they'll see all the linkages between. They will literally helicopter above and see all the linkages, but they will also see the linkages outside. So they'll see the linkages with suppliers. They'll see the linkages with buyers. They'll see the linkages with customers. They have this incredibly holistic view of things. So the one thing that they inevitably do, and they do it year after year after year, and I basically say that this approach should be taken by teams at the very team level, at any management level, is they will go over and review every year: what is our purpose? What are we here for? What is our strategy? What assets do we have and what to be able to fulfill that strategy? And what channels do we have? In other words, where are we going to do it? What sort of behaviors do we need to have? What sort of skills do we need to have? And they will do this very detailed way in order to be able to see what their organization is there for, and therefore everyone within it, what role they're playing. So they're incredibly holistic in that way. They also understand quite quickly that what seems to be a simple issue outside is not such a simple issue. Like, for example, I mean, the classic example of not being holistic is a shoe company which subcontracts the manufacture of its shoes to a factory in Southeast Asia. You can do as a garment company as well, if you like, and thinks, fine, I've subcontracted that. I don't have to worry about that anymore. They're going to supply it, and they're going to come back to me and give me my completed shoes. Unfortunately, because they weren't holistic in looking at it, they didn't realize that when a fire happened and people got killed in that factory, or the media discovered that the conditions under which these people were working were horrendous, they were damaged much more than the subcontractor was damaged. They were blamed for it. Never mind how much legally they had detached themselves. They were blamed for it because they weren't holistic. They didn't see the political climate, the social climate, the damage, the human climate, if you like, that was going on. They only saw themselves as being commercial, legal, whereas in fact they lived in a social world. Now, holistic people always take a look at that, always see that they're living in a social world, always see that they're living in a political world. Hence, if you like, the damage that people who ignored the Me Too movement and people who ignored the diversity and ESGs, when you ignore that, you ignore it at your peril. So holistic people, one of the characteristics they have is they really are alert to that, to holism.
Well, and I can see how at a more micro level within your team, that those same factors play out from a holistic perspective. That if you're only thinking about how is my team successful, but you're not thinking about the other departments that you maybe have to interface with, whose work relies on your work or who you rely on for their contributions, and how your work is part of a bigger system overall and helping the company achieve its goals, that the lack of awareness or attention towards those other elements that are interplaying with your team and with your work and with your employees, or even what's going on in society that might be affecting your team members and their ability to do their work, like the movements around diversity, equity, inclusion, et cetera, that you can get caught off guard and end up in really sticky situations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you're slightly oppositional is if the culture of the team is slightly oppositional, they will focus on, quote unquote, doing the job rather than understanding that you need to sustain relationships. You can't antagonize the team which is working on productizing when you're doing marketing. You can't antagonize them because you're going to have a sustainable relationship with them. And you've got to take a look at that. And talking about diversity as well, you'll find that really the people who have this balanced partnering approach, when they're being holistic, they will look at diversity because they're basically saying my organization is part of a diverse society, and therefore I need to be able to hear the opinions and the perspectives of people reflecting that diverse society.
Yes, yes, yes. All right, let's talk about another one of these compass points. Is there another that feels really resonant for the team level dynamic, or for a leader who is maybe not thinking necessarily from the top, but is trying to lead in their space?
Yeah, let's take a look at that. Yeah, what I call triangular challenge. And this is one that it really, particularly CEOs find it very difficult, but also team leaders find it very difficult. One of the characteristics that these assumptions that these balanced partnering leaders had. They challenged themselves, they challenged others, there was no issue about that, but they ensured, now I'm talking about structurally ensured, that they were challenged by their own organization. And that meant not just challenged in terms of their decisions, but the assumptions that formed those decisions. I think, and you and I have come across so many people who say, but my door is always open. My people know that they can talk to me at any time. Actually, they can talk to you at any time. You will listen to them at any time, possibly, but actually, what are they telling you, and how much do they feel that they can actually challenge not only your decision, but what led to that decision? I think Ray Dalio did that with Bridgewater, where he basically created this system, or so he wrote about, where the meetings were entirely stripped of status, in other words, of hierarchy, and that people were then encouraged to challenge the idea for its merits and challenge the idea. I go a little further, or these people went a little further, because I can't take credit for it. These are their findings. My research people found that the assumptions need to be able to challenge as well. What were you assuming when you did that? Why do you think that we should be going this way rather than that way? Now, teams should be able to do that. I think it's very important that teams should start doing that at this level. If the leader finds that this is uncomfortable, yeah, it's going to be uncomfortable, especially if the leader feels that she is, again, having to compete with her teammates. If you want the job done, if you want the best possible, most thought out idea to be expressed and to be put forward, that's the way to do it. Get them to challenge you and the assumptions that you make, but don't only make it about you. Challenge others people as well, and their assumptions as well. The danger, Mamie, is, and I've seen this happen a lot, is that being challenged, the higher you get, and therefore the more you're getting challenged, if you like, being challenged and looking for outside views to be challenged, if you like, becomes exhausting. And eventually leaders start to default to their inner circle, where the group then becomes more important. Team spirit becomes more important than the job. My plea and my approach with certainly when I'm working with teams is start it early. Start it when you're at that basic team level. Make sure that your team, your partner with your team, you're not the leader. Think of yourself as the managing partner. Make sure that you use their ideas, their thoughts, their challenges, and you are able to do that with them to make sure, A, that you're getting the best ideas, but B, that you don't get groupthink. You don't cut yourself off. You don't put yourself into a bubble.
So important. So important. And I was actually just in a meeting a little earlier today where we were doing exactly that, of challenging assumptions. And we were debating about an audience and which way we wanted to go with a market. And I caught myself advocating really strongly and said, wait a second, let me take a step back. Let me lay out my assumptions about this audience. And let's grapple with those assumptions rather than going back and forth on, is this the right decision or the wrong decision? And it was so helpful because you actually get to find those better answers, the deeper thinking. And it's not always easy to recognize our own assumptions. And the more that we can do that, the more that we can challenge each other and see it's not as confrontational, but as enriching and in partnering, I think you're right that it's so much stronger thinking that comes out of those conversations. And it's something that managers have to foster. They have to foster that environment and say, what assumptions are we making here? What assumptions are underlying your position so that we can debate those as opposed to just the ideas.
Yeah. And I think there's something about, as you were talking there and talking about challenging assumptions as well, we still, I suspect, I may be wrong, but I certainly feel that we still seem to think that the prevailing ethos, if you like, about managing and leading companies is leading from the front, leading from with your gut, leading all those and not actually taking the time, the care to really plan, to really think about, to really delve into what leads you to make decisions, how do you make decisions, and how do you actually bring your entire organization with you? Because success is not just leading for the shareholders, or if you're in a team, leading to make sure that your boss is happy because that's the target that your boss has set. Success is actually making sure that you reach your targets, but you also bring your entire team with you so that they will do better, even better next time. They will make more successes for you next time. So I think that's really important, to actually start that challenge base becomes something that becomes the source, the seed of sustainability in the real sense of the word, sustainability of an organization, I think.
Yeah, I love that. I love that we're creating the mentality that we challenge each other, not because we're trying to figure out who's smartest or who's right or who has the best ideas, but we challenge each other because collectively, that is how we do better. So beautiful. Yeah. All right. There's another one of these compass points that I would love for us to talk about, which is the pragmatism and do the best possible. So can you talk about that one? Because I think it maybe relates, especially around decision making.
Yeah, I basically, we've said do the best possible until the possible is no longer best, then change the possible. So, and there are a couple of examples here. One was actually a personal example. I, in my younger days, worked for a television company in Britain. And this television company was hit by a strike, basically, because the camera people and, in fact, all the technicians were looking to get increased pay, quite an increased pay. And the company basically decided they weren't going to do it. So they went on strike. And the strike then continued for 9 months. The CEO decided very quickly after the start of the strike that they were going to use all of management and anybody who wasn't on strike to actually do the jobs, if you like, of the technicians. Now, we're not going to talk about the moral merits of this, but this is an example of what I was talking about. And this continued for about 6 to 8 months. And he realized that he was doing the best possible to keep the company going, to keep advertisers in there, to keep revenues going, et cetera, et cetera. And then he realized that this is no longer possible to sustain. So for some strange reason, Amy, he then came to me, and I was the foreign editor. I wasn't even a manager at that stage. And he said, "Barden, I believe you know something about organizations." He'd been obviously looking at my CV, and he saw that I had somewhere I'd studied at organizational development at one stage. So he thought this was good enough. And he knew me. So he said, "I want you to go away, lock yourself up in a hotel room, don't care how long it takes, come back with a reorganization, a restructuring of this entire organization so that we can run it and manage it so that everybody is as happy as possible and the conditions are better than anything that the unions ever thought of. And I want you to do it and make sure that this organization, this new reorganization, also ensures that we continue to succeed and gain listeners and viewers." Off I went. I thought he was mad, actually. But off I went and I did this. And I knew the organization very well. So I started off by saying, thinking, what is the purpose of this organization? And then working back, how are we going to structure it to do that? I came back and gave him this document, and he said, okay, I like this. Let's go and present it to the board. We presented it to the board, and then we rolled it out. And I'll tell you another story later about this man. But basically, what he decided was I would do the best possible by continuing to run this organization with the resources we had. Then, when that's no longer possible, I'll stand the whole thing on its head, change the entire organization, and so that it can run sustainably, strike or no strike.
Wow. That's a huge shift and a huge transformation to say, I'm doing the best possible, but I need to change what is possible now because this is no longer working. This is no longer the best. And to really be able to take a step back and imagine something completely new and different, or to stretch yourself or your team in a way that expands the thinking, that is huge.
Yeah. And it comes from this navigational, if you like, the navigational foundation that basically says, don't just think about where you're going. Don't just think about one destination. Think about what you're trying to do. Think about your purpose. And therefore, at some stage, you might have to change your destination. You might have to change your purpose. You might have to change the possible. I think Netflix, for example, did something like that, didn't they? When they started by saying, okay, so we're a distributor of content. We're a distributor of content through CDs. And then they said, okay, so now we're not actually distributors of CDs. We need to change the distribution system and become a streamer of content. And then they realized, hang on, we need to change the possible here completely. We're not just a distributor of content. We are content. We create content. We are all about content. Change the possible.
All right. Well, I think this is the perfect place for us to end. So can you tell us about a great manager that you worked for and what made this person such a fantastic boss?
Well, it was funny enough, this one, when the guy who asked me to reorganize, his name was Bruce Ginjal, and he died some years ago. He's an Australian who was, in fact, the first person to ever appear on television in Australia. And Bruce was by no means a perfect boss. He had a lot of flaws and faults, and I loved him. I loved him for that. But he was the one that gave me probably my greatest sense of learning. When he then said, let's go and roll out this new organization of yours, and I said, okay, so who's going to do that? He said, oh, you are. I said, oh, goody. So I said, so what title are you going to give me? And what's my pay? He said, you're going to have no title, my friend, no title at all, and there's no pay extra. And I said, Bruce, I've got to implement stuff with people who are my seniors, who have got more power than I have, basically the director of programs, the director of operations. And I said, you're giving me this with no title, no power at all. He said, your first lesson, my friend, in negotiating without power.
Beautiful. Oh, I feel like we just need to let that sit for a second because it's such an important lesson in life. But where can people learn more about you, get a copy of your book, and learn about the other components of the compass?
Okay, so the book is called How Successful Leaders Do Business with Their World. It's available on Amazon. It's available, I think, on all sites. It's published by Routledge. There's more stuff on my website, which is stephenbarden.org. And also I do a podcast as well, which is called The Power of Balance, which you can see where that comes from. And I've got a number of podcasts on then, and there is a bit more about the whole thing about the navigational stance. And then finally, I do quite a lot of posting on LinkedIn as well, which you can find me, Stephen Barden, there.
Well, thank you so much again for joining me today. I really enjoyed getting to hear some of your stories and dig a little deeper into these different components of great leadership.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you very much.
Stephen is providing his guide to preparing for an important conversation to patron members of the Modern Manager community. In this guide, he shares key questions to ask about yourself, the other person, the value of the conversation, and the desired outcome. Stephen shares how to use this guide during our extended interview, which is available to all members. To listen to that extended interview and get the guide, become a member at themodernmanager.com/join. And if you work for a government or nonprofit agency, you get 20% off of any membership level. All the links are in the show notes, and they can be delivered to your inbox when you subscribe to my newsletter. Find that at themodernmanager.com. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.
Meetings are one of the most critical components of healthy collaboration, and teams are at the heart of how we work. Meteor helps you use your time in meetings productively, build healthy relationships with your colleagues, and move work forward. To learn how we do it, visit meteor.com. That's MEETEOR.com.
You've been listening to The Modern Manager. You're already becoming a rock star boss of a thriving team, I can tell. To ensure you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player and join the mailing list at mamieks.com/podcast. That's MAMIEKS.com/podcast to get show notes and other special content delivered directly to your inbox. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.